Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So today I would like us to finish up Frankenstein, and we could also talk about the poem To His Coy Mistress, because remember, those are the two required texts that we need to finish by the end of this week before we can jump back into our textbook, because these are two of the texts that they are using as examples when they are modeling all the different critical approaches that we're going to be learning about throughout the semester. So if you have time for Young Goodman Brown or any of the other texts that we've listed that are included in the book, and that's also Hamlet, Everyday Use, and Huck Finn, I seriously doubt we have time for all of them, but if you have time for any additional texts beyond To His Coy Mistress and Frankenstein, feel free. That's only going to help you, but you only need to do these two as requirements. Okay, so we already went through most of Frankenstein last week. I provided some kind of rapid chapter by chapter plot summary just to keep you guys oriented, just so you know what's going on as you work your way through the novel, because a lot happens in this book. You probably noticed it's a very eventful plot. A lot's going on, and as we've said, the language can be sort of difficult to get through at times because it sounds so different from our own usage. So that old-fashioned style can slow us down, and also just the sheer number of events that take place over the course of this relatively short novel can be hard to keep up with. So I wanted to do some of the plot summary for you guys so you wouldn't have to necessarily do it so much yourselves. I really want you guys to focus more on personal response. I don't want you to get so hung up on every single event of the plot. And like I said before, I don't need you to fixate exclusively on the major themes either, because we all kind of know a lot of the main themes associated with this novel because the novel is so famous, because it's been adapted to so many different TV shows and movies and comics. This is a story that we all know very well, even if we've never read the novel before. We're getting the original version, but we've all been exposed to various versions of this story, whether that's a movie, something on TV, some Halloween themed kids show. I mean, Frankenstein's creature shows up in all kinds of popular media. And the figure of the mad scientist, Victor Frankenstein, might also show up a lot today as well. So we know the themes, I think, already. We know the plot already, at least in a general way. So I just wanted to cover a few more details, make sure we feel good about what's going on, so then we can record our impressions. I really want you guys to do that either while you're reading or as soon as you finish reading. Remember what we talked about in week 1, the foundation that's necessary for any kind of analysis or interpretation. You know, the kind of work that we do in literary study, the foundation for any of that will always be personal response. Before you can start analyzing a literary text, you have to respond to it. You have to record your thoughts, your impressions, how you feel about the text. A lot of that is very emotional. And see, like we talked about in week 1, because it's more emotional than intellectual, a lot of students are sort of afraid of the response, or they're a little bit apprehensive to really engage in it because it might not feel academic enough. They feel like they shouldn't have an emotional response. They should simply have an intellectual understanding of the text. And yes, eventually we would like to have that intellectual understanding, but I would argue that the emotional response has to come first. That's the foundation. We record our impressions, we record our thoughts and our feelings, and we're also observing, and we're, pointing out the most important things in the text, the things that were most important to us, the characters, the scenes, the moments, the individual examples of language, the individual words or sentences that really made an impression on us, or the characters that we liked, the settings that really made us feel like we could see what the author was describing. We could really feel like we were there. Whatever grabs you, whatever strikes you as really interesting or important, you can make notes about that. You can record your feelings about that. And then you can return to some of that stuff later because you might want to analyze it. If you're really interested in this particular character, you have a lot of thoughts, you have a lot of feelings about the character, then go ahead and jot some of those down so you remember, and later you can do more work with that character. That's often how this type of stuff goes, right? We start with the emotional response, we write some stuff down, and then we have more to work with when it is time to analyze and interpret. So you always want to plan ahead by observing, identifying, and recording just your own reading experience. It's going to be different for everybody. What is it like for you going through this novel? What is it like for you reading the poem To His Coy Mistress? What do you think? How do you feel? Go from there. All right. Never be afraid to start with those kinds of emotional responses. All right, so I believe last week we left off around chapter 17 or 18 in Frankenstein. And remember, Victor and the creature sort of made a deal at the point at which we stopped last week. So remember, they have that very dramatic confrontation on the mountainside, and it's kind of an argument at first. Victor is refusing to really do anything for the creature at first. But what the creature wants is for Victor to create a partner or a mate for the creature. So basically to create some, another creature to keep the first one company, I guess would be the best way of thinking about it. Remember, we talked about this last week. The creature, remember, we might not want to call it the monster. We can, but Harold Bloom told us to refer to it more as the creature. The creature is lonely. The creature has been rejected by virtually all the people that it's come into contact with, beginning with Victor, its own creator. Victor runs away from the creature almost immediately, rejects it, hates it. And then all the other people that the creature comes across, the villagers, the French family, the little kid, they all reject him. They're all afraid of him. They're all disgusted by him. They hate him, right? And he's really affected by that rejection. He's feeling very isolated. But remember, he's not the only character that's experiencing isolation and feelings of loneliness. We know that Victor does at times, and we also know that Captain Walton feels some of those same emotions. Remember, we meet Walton at the very beginning. He's the ship captain. He rescues Victor in the Arctic. And Walton actually begins the story as our narrator, begins the novel as our narrator. And then he picks up the narration again at the very end after Victor dies. Spoiler alert. So Walton sort of starts the novel and ends the novel. So he's an interesting character as well. He's not as important as Victor or the creature, but he's a little bit of a mirror image of Victor. Remember, they're both very ambitious. They both want to push the limits of human understanding, of discovery, invention. They want fame. They want to do things that previous people had never done. So they're similar in that regard, right? But Walton is feeling lonely on his expedition because he doesn't have any buddies, and he sort of becomes friends with Victor. So we have multiple characters who are experiencing loneliness, isolation, alienation, feeling cut off from other people, feeling alone, and we see the psychological damage that can cause. So the creature wants a partner. The creature wants a companion, a very reasonable request. So the creature tells Victor, look, if you make me a partner, I will disappear. I will not bother humans anymore. I will not be seen by humans anymore, and you will not have to worry about me. So Victor's reluctant, but eventually he agrees. So they make a deal. If Victor makes the partner for the creature and that partner will disappear and live in total isolation, separate from all humans. That's the deal. So that's where we pick up in chapter 18 as we kind of observe Victor's progress as he begins to work on the second creature. But we also get access to Victor's feelings and his thoughts. And we know that Victor's not feeling great. He goes back to Geneva, back to his family, but he has to live this kind of double life. He has to be dishonest about what he's actually doing. He can't tell anybody that he's trying to reanimate dead body parts once again. He's already done it once, and now he's trying to do it again. So he can't really tell anybody, right? Or at least he can't tell his family. He can't tell Elizabeth. And he also can't tell Elizabeth the real reason why he's postponing their marriage. And he's starting to get questions about that. What's taking so long? Why don't you two finally get married, settle down, have a family? So he has to kind of make up a bogus excuse for postponing the marriage, but really he just wants to wait until he's created the second creature, and then he wants to get married once all of that is done and he is free from this terrible responsibility. So a lot of stuff's going on with Victor. He's going through a lot. He eventually leaves with Henry to go to England, where he can continue his research and he has access to kind of the latest scientific discoveries. So he has this real sense of foreboding, this real sense of despair and evil. He knows something else bad is going to happen, but he feels like he has to continue. So he goes to Scotland. He's isolated. He's working alone. He's continuing to work on what he calls his unearthly occupation. Remember what we talked about last week. There's this idea that Victor has violated a law of nature by reanimating what was previously dead. He is doing something that no human should really do. No human should really have that power. And people certainly felt that way back then in the early 1800s. And you might even argue that people still pretty much feel that way today. I mean, obviously, humans have a certain amount of ability to create life, right? But not in the way that Victor's doing it, not in a lab, the way Victor's doing it. So he's kind of violating some principle or some rule of nature, and he's sort of suffering the consequences of that. And even he's aware that what he's doing is unearthly. No one on earth should be doing it. No human should be doing it, but he doesn't feel like he has any choice at this point. But, he's increasingly having strong second thoughts. He has a lot of fear about what's going to happen if he does create this second creature. What if the second creature doesn't agree to the deal? What if the second creature's like, yeah, I want to live right here in Geneva. I don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to live out in some forbidden, mountainside. So what if the deal is off? What if the two creatures that he's created end up having offspring? What if they create more of these monstrous sort of creations? So he's really starting to worry, like, what might happen down the road if I follow through on this. And also, of course, he's just grossed out, right? He's disgusted by what he's doing. And he even wonders if the new creature will be disgusted by the original creature. Like, what if she's not into him? What if she is just as horrified as all the humans are when they encounter the creature? So he has all these fears, all these doubts. He really doesn't want to go through with it. But then the breaking point occurs one night. He's alone, working in his lab. And he looked through the window and he sees that the creature, the original, is watching him, sort of monitoring his progress, probably making sure that Victor is holding up his end of the bargain. And that's just too much for Victor. He's again overcome by this hatred for the creature, this disgust. He just doesn't want to be doing this anymore. So he tears up, he destroys the second being that he had been creating. He sort of dismembers it, destroys it. So decides, no, I'm not going to keep up the deal. I'm not going to create this second creature. So that's pretty much the breaking point for these two. Like, if there was any chance at a reconciliation or some kind of peace treaty, it is over now. The monster is obviously very upset. He vows revenge, and he tells Victor, this is a very famous line that usually gets included in a lot of the movie adaptations, as a very ominous, frightening threat. He tells Victor, I will be with you on your wedding night. So we'll see what he means by that in a few chapters, but Victor knows that's not good. That's a very ominous threat, and he knows the monster is plotting revenge. And that revenge really begins in chapter 21. Victor's always up to something, like he's out at sea at one point here, trying to dispose of the remains of the creature that he just destroyed. And he sort of gets lost at sea for a while. So he's gone for a little bit. And while he's gone, the creature strikes again. The creature commits another murder. And Henry finds out once he gets back to dry land, he's actually brought in for questioning as a suspect. And he immediately thinks, oh, it's the creature. The creature's up to no good. And remember, the creature has already killed Henry's youngest brother, William. And also, the creature framed Justine, the servant girl in their family, in the Frankenstein family, for the murder. So Victor already blames himself for both of those crimes, and now he's afraid that the creature has committed another crime, and that's true. But what he comes to find out is that the creature has killed Henry, and that's Victor's best friend, right? Really the only friend that has been there for him throughout all of his struggles. They're obviously very close. He's relied on Henry. Henry's been very helpful, and now Henry's dead. So Victor once again kind of has an emotional breakdown. We saw this happen to him earlier after the death of his brother, and after Justine is like condemned to execution, for the crime. So he's again sort of having a mental breakdown. He's feeling a lot of guilt, a lot of grief, a lot of anxiety, obviously. And also, he kind of he claims that he's responsible, which I think is taken as like an admission of guilt. So he's actually arrested and briefly held as the responsible party. They think he's the murderer, but really what he means is, I'm responsible for Henry's death because I created this rampaging monster that keeps killing people. But Victor has this like really serious health scare, right? He has a fever, he's delirious, he's in a prison cell for a while, but then eventually his name is cleared. They realize he is innocent. There's an eyewitness account that, verifies that he was not present when Henry was killed, and he also recovers from the fever and eventually goes back to his family's home in Geneva, in Switzerland, where he's from. He recovers, physically speaking, and in chapter 22, he and Elizabeth get married. But he's very worried about the creature's threat, so he's trying to be on guard and vigilant throughout the wedding festivities. And he tells Elizabeth that he will share his grief and his sorrow and his secrets with her after the wedding is over. So he's getting ready to kind of come clean. He wants to be free of all of this creature stuff. He wants to start a new life, but he realizes that he's probably going to have some kind of fateful struggle or battle with the demon, as he refers to it as. The demon that he created. He envisions them having a struggle to the death, and he thinks that might be necessary to finally destroy the creature and move on with his life. Or the creature will destroy him, and that will be the end of it. But in chapter 23, we see what the creature's plan for revenge really was on the wedding night. The plan wasn't to kill Henry. The plan wasn't to kill Victor. The plan was to kill Elizabeth. And that's what the creature does. While Victor is standing guard outside her door, the creature gets into the room, strangles her, and then escapes before Victor can pursue him. And then a whole mob starts chasing the creature, but the creature gets away. but not before grinning at Victor. And now Victor vows revenge. So revenge pretty much fuels these two characters for the rest of the novel, for the final few chapters of the novel. So at this point, Victor's really lost everything. I think his father dies around this time. His wife is dead. His best friend is dead. His youngest brother is dead. And he decides, I have to destroy the creature. That's really all that's left for him. He doesn't have much else to live for. He must destroy the creature. So that brings us really to the final chapter of the novel, chapter 24. And this also brings us to the end of Victor's narration. So remember, Victor has been the narrator for most of the novel, but he's not the narrator for the entire novel. So when the book starts, the narrator is Walton. And remember, Walton is writing a letter to his sister while he's on this expedition to the Arctic. He's trying to, I don't know, discover the North Pole or make some kind of great breakthrough or discovery that nobody's ever done before. Because remember, Walton, like Victor, is very ambitious. He wants fame. He wants to push the limits of human understanding and accomplishment, just like Victor does. So we start with Walton, and here in chapter 24, we get back to Walton, because Victor wraps up his narration about a third of the way through that chapter, and then Walton picks it back up again with his letter to his sister. So then Walton really narrates the rest of that final chapter. But also remember that in some of the middle chapters, we actually had the creature narrating for a while. The creature, remember, is telling, his story to Victor when they meet on the mountainside. Like the creature's kind of filling Victor in on everything that's happened since Victor abandoned the creature and ran away long ago. So we got a few chapters with the creature as narrator. We get Walton as narrator at the very beginning and the very end. But then for most of the novel, Victor is the narrator. But as Victor winds down his story, he basically emphasizes that he has no more human ties. He doesn't have anyone left that's close to him. So once again, he's isolated. He's alone, both literally because, Walton's crew finds him floating on an ice block all by himself in the North Pole, but he's also alone spiritually. He's alone in terms of companionship, love, and just interpersonal relationships. All the ones that mattered to him were destroyed by the creature. So he's got nothing left except hunting the creature down. And that's what he's been doing. He's been pursuing the creature, stalking the creature into the Arctic. So he's been sort of he's been on the creature's trail. And sometimes he's been learning more from like villagers. Sometimes the creature leaves clues for Victor. And the creature even leaves food at times for Victor because the creature wants Victor to stay alive. They both want this final confrontation. They both want like a final fight to resolve this conflict between them, to resolve this conflict that's really gotten out of hand, right? They have both hurt each other a lot. So they really want this final resolution. They want to have a final battle. They both seem to envision that being a largely physical kind of fight. And then they want that to really bring an end to this terrible, series of events. So they have a really weird sort of codependent relationship, Victor and the creature. They hate each other, obviously. They spend much of the novel trying to kill each other or trying to hurt each other in various ways, but they also kind of rely on each other, right? I mean, obviously the monster, the creature, sort of relies on Victor because Victor created it. Victor is its maker. It's only here because Victor created it and put it here. So the monster, the creature, wanted a relationship with Victor, but never really got to have one. Meanwhile, Victor hates the creature, but also has realized that he's ultimately responsible for the creature. And even in this final sort of Arctic showdown, as they're, hopping from ice flow to ice flow, even then they're kind of dependent on each other. Trying to destroy each other gives the other one meaning, right? Their only real meaning left in their lives is to hurt the other one because they're both isolated. They've both lost or never had, in the case of the creature, any other relationships that are significant to them anymore. Victor's lost all of his, and the creature never got to have any relationships because he's been rejected by everybody. And that trend started with Victor rejecting the creature. That came first. So it's a weird relationship. They hate each other, but they kind of need each other. They give each other purpose and meaning, even though they ultimately want to destroy each other. So you could really analyze their relationship because it's quite complex and, of course, very destructive. So this is pretty much the point at which we first met Victor back at the beginning of the novel. This is when Walton's crew finds him. He's exhausted. He's been chasing the creature for a long time, but he finally loses sight of the creature and he's alone. And he's run out of food and he's exhausted. And that's when Walton and his crew rescue Victor, kind of nurse him back to health on the ship. But then we discover once Walton starts narrating again, once he starts writing his letter, to his sister again, we learn that things aren't going great on the ship. Like, the expedition has hit some difficult times. Frankenstein has fallen gravely ill. So, Victor Frankenstein is ill. He's sick. He's probably not going to make it. And also, the ship is surrounded on all sides by ice. So the crew, all the sailors that work for Walton, they want to bail. They're like, hey, the expedition's over. We want to turn back. There's no way we can keep going. But Walton doesn't want to give up. Remember, we know Walton's personality. It's just like Victor's. He wants to keep pushing. He doesn't want to acknowledge any limits placed on what he can do. He wants to be famous. He's very ambitious. And like Victor, like we've said, he wants to push the limits of knowledge and discovery. But Victor is a warning to both Walton and to the audience that if you push too far, if you violate the laws of nature in your quest for knowledge, bad things will happen. So that's really the final thing Victor does before he dies. He gives a little bit of advice to Walton. His dying words are directed to Walton, and he tells him, seek happiness and tranquility and avoid ambition. That's what Victor is telling Walton. Don't be so ambitious. Don't always strive for more, more, more. Be content with the little things. Be content with the quiet life. Be content with relaxation and give up some of this ambition. That's good advice. It might have been good advice for Victor, and it's probably good advice for Walton. It's too late for Victor, but it might not be too late for Walton. And we know that Walton is kind of following that advice because he puts a halt to the expedition so he can save the lives of his crew, his own life. Maybe not Victor. Obviously, they don't save Victor, but Walton might still have a chance to kind of rectify his own behavior and his own course in life. So that's kind of it. That's the final message from Victor. And it's an important message in the novel, right? There is a limit to human knowledge. And if you push too far, you might find yourself ruined. So that's not the end of the novel. That's the end of Victor. That's the end of Victor's story because Victor dies. But we finish up with Walton's narration. And we find out that right after Victor dies, Walton hears a noise. He goes back into the cabin and he discovers that the creature has come aboard the ship. And the creature is basically observing the deathbed of Victor Frankenstein. And the creature is upset. The creature is emotional. The creature is apologizing to Victor, who's dead by now. Victor cannot hear him, but the creature is basically asking for Victor's forgiveness. Interesting. Interesting turn, because at other times the creature has been very angry at Victor, but the creature now expresses great regret for all the violence, all the evil that it has done. And then Walton kind of chastises the creature. Walton's like, "Why did you do all this?" And the creature has a very powerful statement, or really a rhetorical question, that he poses to Walton. He says, "Am I thought the only criminal when all humankind sinned against me?" So the creature is asking Walton, am I the only criminal if I was driven to my crimes by basically every human I've ever come into contact with? So this is what a lot of critics bring up. They say, sure, the creature does terrible things, but the creature is pushed to do those terrible things by Victor, by villagers and children and just mean people, basically. So maybe the creature isn't the only one at fault. So again, you can decide for yourself as you're interpreting this novel how you feel about the creature. How do you feel about Victor? How do you feel about some of these themes that we've talked about? The danger of isolation, the dangers of pushing human knowledge to an extreme, the dangers of too much ambition. Uh, are those relevant themes? Do they still matter to us today? And if so, why? But again, as you're responding, try to go through a lot of those literary elements that we've already discussed. Think about setting, think about characters, think about atmosphere, think about Mary Shelley's style. Any of that that's interesting to you, anything that grabs your attention, could potentially be worth analyzing later. So make some notes, jot down observations, and we can return to that stuff later. And let's just wrap up with the final bit from Walton describing the creature, the final couple of sentences here. He sprang from the cabin window as he said this, upon the ice raft which lay close to the vessel. He was soon borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. Memorable final scene. And remember what the creature has just said. He's told Walton that he's going to go to the North Pole and burn himself, like destroy himself, so he can finally bring a resolution to this situation, and so he can no longer be a threat to humans. So presumably that's what the monster's going to do. Victor's already dead, and maybe the creature will soon be, unless we imagine that maybe the creature changes his mind. Maybe he decides to go on living. That's up to you. We don't quite know, but we know what his intentions are. When he leaves Walton, he is going to destroy himself because he thinks that's the best thing to do at this point. So form your opinions, record your thoughts, and hopefully you enjoyed the novel at least a little bit. And also, as a companion to the novel, I do recommend finding a movie or maybe a TV version that you haven't seen before and maybe watching that to just give you a comparison, to give you something else to keep in mind as you're thinking about the novel. Because like I've said before, and like we talked about on the discussion board, this story has been with us nonstop ever since the novel came out in 1818. So you can think about movies, TV shows, comics, like I said in the discussion board, like Halloween, kids stuff. There are so many adaptations of Frankenstein in popular culture, in our contemporary culture. So let's keep thinking about that and find a few examples to kind of consume. Watch something, take a look at something so you can compare it, like one of these newer versions, so you can compare the new version of Frankenstein to the original version that we just read. All right, so let's shift gears now and talk about To His Coy Mistress, the poem that I linked you to in the week 1 and week 2 modules, written by Andrew Marvell, published in the 1680s. So this is a rather old poem. You can tell by the language. You might find it a little bit difficult to understand at times, but of course, as we know, you can find plot summaries online. You can find a basic, discussion of the key themes here, because this poem has been talked about, read, studied, taught argued over for generations. It's been taught in English classrooms for much longer than any of us have been alive. So you can find a lot of stuff on it. That might be worth doing if you wanted to conduct a little bit of research, read a little bit more about the time period, read more about the poet, read more about some of the ideas at work in this particular poem. You can do all of that. But first, you have to sit down with the poem and just sort of wrestle with it and figure some things out for yourself. But I want to help a little bit with that. So I thought right now we could run through the poem, kind of do a little plot summary like we did for Frankenstein, because there is a plot here. Not all poems have clear plots or narratives, but this one kind of does because it's structured as an argument. You really need to think of it that way. We have a speaker here. When we're talking about poems and we're talking about the person narrating the poem, we usually refer to them as the speaker of the poem. So it's basically the same role as a narrator of a novel or a narrator of a short story, but with poetry, we refer to that figure as the speaker. But that's just really the person who's talking, right? The person who is providing us with the actual text that we are reading, right? So we can think of the poem as really being spoken by a person. And that's very much what's happening here. The speaker is addressing somebody else. So we have two characters here. The speaker, who is talking throughout the poem, and then the person that the speaker is talking to, the person the speaker is addressing. So the speaker, we usually assume, is a man, kind of a young-ish, maybe not super young, but youngish man. And the person the speaker is addressing is a young woman. Okay, that's usually the way the poem is read and understood, although you might come up with a different identity for the speaker. But the person being addressed is definitely a young woman. We know that from the title. We know that from a lot of the descriptions that we see in the poem. So there's a particular social dynamic that's going on here. And it's going to be familiar to most of us. But we do have to understand a little bit about the time period and some of the differences between 1681 and 2025. So let's start with the title. Let's think about the title. To His Coy Mistress. Okay, so again, the title basically tells us who the two characters are. The speaker is addressing a coy mistress that he would like to be in a relationship with. So that's really what's happening here. The speaker is addressing a woman, trying to convince the woman to get into a relationship with him, if we want to put it that way. He's trying to convince her to date him, if we want to use more modern language. That's basically what's happening. So he's making a very elaborate argument that can really be broken up into three parts. And the argument is designed to convince this unseen woman who is not really taking an active role, but she's being described, she's being talked to. But the idea is the speaker wants to convince her to date him. That's what he's trying to do. So the speaker has a goal, he has a mission, and he's making an argument in order to accomplish that goal. And within that argument, we can see several different strategies, different poetic devices, different literary elements that he's using to try to persuade the woman that he's addressing. But let's go back to the title. To His Coy Mistress. There's a couple of words here that we might want to look up because they're not commonly used today, or at least they're not used commonly today the way they're being used in the poem. So first, look up the word coy. What does that word mean? Well, if you go to a trusty online dictionary like Merriam-Webster, you will see that to be coy, it's an adjective, so this is describing somebody. And it's usually describing a young woman who is making a pretense of shyness or modesty that is intended to be alluring. That's the definition. Making a pretense of shyness or modesty that is intended to be alluring. So, what does that really mean? Well, to make a pretense basically means to pretend. To pretend like something is true, even though it's really not true. All right. So that's the idea here. This is a woman pretending to be shy and modest because they think that pretending will be attractive or alluring to a potential partner or mate. That's the idea. All right. So that's how the speaker is describing this woman. He is describing her as coy. He thinks that she is coy. In other words, he thinks that she is pretending to be shy because it's attractive. He doesn't necessarily think that she's really shy. He thinks that she's making sort of a show or a pretense of being shy. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. That's what coy means. And then think about the word mistress. Now, we know this word, but we typically use it in a very particular way in modern times. So if you look up the word mistress, you'll see several definitions, including the one that we're most familiar with, which is a woman who is engaged in an extramarital relationship. But that's not the way Marvell is using the term, right? That's not what he means. If you keep scrolling down the list of different definitions for mistress, you'll see several. Actually, the first one is interesting. The first one is not the one we think of. The first one is a woman in a position of authority. So the example they give, like in a sentence, is she is always the mistress of the situation. She's always coolly self-aware, self-possessed, and in control. So you could be a mistress of a situation, meaning you're in charge. Like in older times, maybe a teacher, a schoolmistress would have been a term that you would have used. She's the mistress of the classroom. She's in charge. She's in control of that particular space. So you could be a mistress of people, of things, of a situation, a location. It just means you're in charge. You're a woman that's in charge, a woman who is in charge of a particular thing or place. So we don't use it that way so much anymore, but that is another definition of the word. But you have to keep scrolling down to find the way Marvell is using it in this poem. Okay, because you have to find the archaic definition. Archaic means super old. So when you find archaic definitions of words, that means that the word really isn't used this way anymore. But this is the way it used to be used. So the archaic meaning of the word mistress is a woman, usually a young woman, who is being, courted, being pursued by a man. A woman who is loved and admired and pursued by a man. And that is the usage of mistress that we're getting here. A woman loved and courted by a man. That's what the speaker means when he refers to this woman as a mistress. He doesn't mean that she's having an affair. Okay, that is very much not what he means. Okay, he means that she is simply a young woman that he loves and admires. And I think you guys are familiar with the concept of courtship. I think you know what courtship is. We don't really use it as much anymore, but there's still kind of a relationship between courtship and dating, right? I think we sort of understand those terms as similar, right? But in olden times, you would have talked about a man courting a woman, right? That just meant sort of wooing her, trying to impress her, trying to do nice things for her, trying to show her that the man would be a good partner, a good mate, a good husband. So a process of trying to win over the woman. That would often be referred to as courting. If the man was courting a woman. And yes, in previous eras, this was very gendered. This was very much a thing that a man was supposed to do. A man was supposed to court a woman, and a woman was supposed to be more passive and just sort of be on the receiving end of the courtship, of the admiration. And if she liked it, if she was persuaded by the courtship, she would accept the man and they would be together and they would get married, most likely. So that's what's going on here, right? Our speaker is courting a woman that he wants to be with. They're not together yet. They're not a couple. They might never be a couple, but he is trying to persuade her that they should be a couple. He is courting her. He is wooing her. And this still happens, right? We still see this in dating, right? There's a process of trying to impress the other person, trying to show off your best attributes. So we can kind of imagine that the speaker is doing that. But more specifically, he's making an argument. And he's hoping that this argument will persuade the woman to be with him. So I want to break his argument down into 3 parts so we can really understand what he's saying. And I can translate some of the language here. I don't want to read the poem line for line. So let's just paraphrase. Let's update the language and basically get a general understanding of what the speaker is talking about in each part of his argument. All right, so we have a total of 46 lines here, divided up into 3 parts. So let's start with part 1, beginning with line 1, and this will go all the way to line 20. If you notice, line 21 is indented. So that means we're starting a new section there. So the first section is from line 1 to line 20. And in this first section, the speaker is basically telling the woman, if we had nothing but time, if we had plenty of time, I would be happy to just admire you. And you would never have to really be with me in an official capacity. That's basically his meaning. Look at the first line. Had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. So he's telling her, if we had limitless time, you could be as coy as you want to be. You wouldn't ever have to accept my advances. You could just be coy, and I could just admire you. And we could just kind of hang out. Not really as a couple. Maybe if you wanted to be a couple, that would be fine. But remember, he's addressing all of this to her. He's talking to her. So he's basically saying, if we had plenty of time, I wouldn't mind if you wanted to be coy. But take his meaning, right? Understand his larger point. His larger point is, I want to be with you, but you're coy. So you're acting shy. And you're acting like you can't really make a decision or make a commitment. And he's saying that would be fine if we had all the time in the world. I would just kick back and admire your beauty. And he uses hyperbole to talk about this, right? He says that he would admire her for like hundreds of years, right? 100 years he would spend praising her eyes, multiple hundreds of years, thousands of years for the rest of her body, right? That's hyperbole, intentional exaggeration used to make a point. His point is, I could admire you forever. Right? I think you're very lovely. I could just admire your beauty. We could hang out, go to some rivers, just kind of do fun stuff, and you could be coy, and that would be fine. So that's the whole first part, right? The whole first section, the first 20 lines. That's basically what he's saying. I would spend all of this time praising and admiring you, and we would never actually have to get together if we had nothing but time. But, look at line 21. But at my back, I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. So in other words, we don't have limitless time. We're going to die one day. So he's asking her, forcing her to really reckon with her mortality. The fact that they're both going to die. And we should remember that in the late 1600s, the typical life expectancy for would be a lot lower than it is now. So people didn't live nearly as long back then. We didn't have nearly the sort of advances in medicine and science that we have now, or even that we had during Victor's day about 200 years later. So you got to remember that back then people could die of a bad cold. I mean, people could die of you fall down, you get a bad wound in your leg, it gets infected, and next thing you know, you're dead. I mean, people died of a lot of preventable illnesses and diseases that would never kill people today. So that is kind of important because he's saying, look, we might die relatively soon, right? We're not old yet, but we might not live that much longer. So we can't wait. He says it would be nice to wait. And that whole first section, if we had nothing but time, we could just hang out. But then when we get to line 21 and we're in section 2, he's saying, but we don't have all this time. We don't have all this time to wait. We're going to die. And once we die, your beauty means nothing. Once you die, we can't have a relationship. And he even mentions her virtue, another word that we use differently today than we used back then. Back then, when the word virtue got thrown around, especially in reference to a woman, it almost always referred to her virginity. And you guys probably know this from reading history and just knowing about olden times. But in older societies, women were typically expected to be virgins when they got married. Women typically got married at a very young age, and because of certain religious and kind of, societal standards that existed back then, it was thought to be very important that the woman maintained her virtue, which basically means she's a virgin. She hasn't really been with anybody until the wedding night when she can be with her husband. So that's really what he means. He's like, hey, you're beautiful, you're virginal, that's all great, but when you're dead, it's not really going to matter. Nobody's going to care about your beauty or your virtue once you're dead. So who cares, right? Let's enjoy life while we can, right? We can't be in a relationship when we're dead. That's really how he ends that second section. Look at line 32. We can't embrace when we're dead. We can't be in love. We can't have a relationship. It'll be too late by then. So that's what he's saying in the second section. And then we get to the third and final section, starting with line 33. This is like his final conclusion, his final pitch that he wants to make to this woman to try to convince her to be with him. So he's already said, I would love to admire you forever, but I can't because we're going to die and we're going to run out of time. So his final conclusions that he reaches in the third section is, let's get together now. Let's have an intimate relationship now before it's too late. Let's enjoy ourselves. Let's have fun because we will die and all of this will go away relatively soon. Let's not wait. Let's live. And then we get to those final couple of lines. Though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. So the sun represents the passage of time. The speaker is speaking figuratively here, right? Not necessarily literally. He's saying we can't stop time. Right? We can't make time stand still. So again, the sun represents the passage of time because the sun comes up each day, sets at the end of the day. That represents the passage of time. One day ending, the next day beginning. So he's saying we can't stop that. We can't make the sun stand still. But we can have so much fun. We can live so energetically that we can make it hard for the sun to keep up with us. We can make the sun run just to keep up with us because we're living so fully and so energetically. And that's the end. That's the end of his argument. And you guys can decide how persuasive you think it is. So let's talk about the speaker. Let's talk about the woman he's addressing. We can talk about some other things that we might identify in the poem, but I wanted to give us a lens through which to do this. A lens. This is really what it is to use different critical approaches. Different schools of literary criticism will give you different lenses, different perspectives through which to analyze a work of literature. So this is very useful, right? Sometimes you need a particular lens so you can get an entry point into a text. So you can find an original sort of feature or an original contribution that you can make. How do you tackle this text? How can you start to really analyze it and interpret it? Often by using a critical lens, you'll be able to generate more ideas. You'll be able to focus on particular areas, and that's going to help you as you continue to do this kind of work. So I was just looking for some articles about the poem, and I found a good one that focuses on pronouns. So just bear with me for a moment. I know pronouns don't sound very exciting. These are the words that usually indicate either a first person speaker or they can be stand-ins for people's names, right? So you guys know what pronouns are, right? But think about first person pronouns and second person pronouns. So we're going to get a lot of both of those in the poem. So you guys know first person pronouns. I, me, right? These are pronouns that refer to the person speaking, right? So if you are using first person narration, if you are a first person narrator, you're going to use a lot of these first person pronouns. I did this. This happened to me. Okay? But also remember that there can be a singular first person pronoun, and there can also be a plural first person pronoun. So if I'm by myself, I would say I. But if I'm with my partner, I would say we. We did this. We did that. We really enjoyed that movie version of Frankenstein that we watched last night. So is it singular? Is it just one person? Or is it plural, which means two or more people? That's important. So let's think about first person pronouns in the poem and how our speaker is using them. Okay? And let's think about the difference between I and we, right? Because I means that the speaker is alone. And the speaker doesn't want to be alone. The speaker wants to be in a relationship with this woman. He wants them to be a we. So let's think about when he says I versus when he says we. Okay? Because he uses both of those first person pronouns quite a lot. And then let's also think about second person pronouns. These are kind of weird. The most common second person pronoun that we use today is you, right? So first person is I, second person is you, and third person would be he or she. Substitutes for John, Mary, whatever their actual names might be, right? So we don't get third person here. We're getting only first person and second person. So second person nowadays would just be you. Like if you're addressing somebody, you could be coy. You could go to the river. You could be beautiful. You do this. You do that, right? So he uses that form. He uses that particular second person pronoun. He refers to this woman as you quite a bit. But we need to remember that in the 1600s, they had another type of second person pronoun that we don't really have anymore. We don't use it anymore. It still exists. But when we hear it, we immediately think old-timey, Shakespeare. But that's right. I mean, we're in that general era here. So I'm referring to thou, thee, and thy. Those would be the forms that are equivalent to you, your, and yours. So referring to somebody as thou, a different version of you. It's still a second person pronoun, but in Marvell's time, when this poem was written, you would use these two second person pronouns in different ways. So you would say thou if you're experiencing an intimate relationship with somebody, if you are very close to somebody, if this is a loved one, a romantic partner, you would use thou because it indicates closeness, intimacy, and a high level of familiarity. Okay? But if you're being more formal, if you're sort of making a formal address to somebody that you don't know as well and somebody that you certainly don't have an intimate relationship with, you would say you, right? So keep that in mind. Two lovers, two people in a relationship would refer to each other as thou, right? That would be how they would address each other, thou. But if I'm talking to my professor, my boss, it would be you. That's more formal. So thou is intimate. It's like what a couple would say. And you is more formal. That's what you would say to a person that you're not romantically involved with. So remember that. Now let's track some of the different usages of pronouns in the poem because they say a lot about tone. They really show you how the speaker is manipulating his tone and in turn, perhaps manipulating the woman that he is addressing, or at least he's trying to do that, right? So there are times when he refers to this woman as thou. Those are the moments when he wants to really express his desire for intimacy with her. And there are also times when he refers to them as we, envisioning them as a couple. But then there's other times when he refers to her as you. Those are the more distant times when he's kind of feeling like she's not really into him. And he also says I during those times because he's alone. He's not really with her in those moments. So pronouns aren't just words. They are clues as to the tone and the feelings of the speaker. At times, he's feeling very close to this woman. At other times, he might be feeling a little bit rejected and pushed away by her. And the different pronouns indicate those different moments. Let's just see a few examples. We don't have time to chart all of these, but let's just go to the first section and we'll sort of get an idea of how this works. Okay, so in line 1, right, had we but world enough and time. So right off the bat, he's using the plural first person pronoun to envision them as a couple. If we could be hanging out, at least, and we had all of this time, I would just admire you and you would just be coy and that would be fine. So he starts that way, right? But then he sort of shifts a little bit because he wants to have an intimate relationship with her, but he's also recognizing that they don't have that kind of relationship yet, right? So he kind of starts with the intimate, right? Thou. He addresses her as thou. We could pass our long love's day, thou by the Indian Ganges side, should rubies find, envisioning her doing this, right? I by the tide of Humber would complain, right? But now notice, he wants to be a couple, but in this early vision, they're not together yet. And he's even saying they wouldn't have to be together if he could just admire her for all time, right? If they didn't have to worry about ever dying. So notice that he shifts back to the singular first person pronoun. I would love you 10 years before the flood. So he's an individual again. I'm doing this solo. I don't know that you're going to love me back, but I can love you this long. Right? And then notice he uses the second person pronoun you right after that. This is like on line 8. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse for a long time. Again, he's using hyperbole, references to the Bible, but basically what he's saying is, I would admire you forever, and you could basically reject me forever. You could keep being coy forever, and that would be fine. But he's noticing the distance between them. And he shows that by saying, I would love you, but you would be coy. So by using the more formal second person pronoun you, he's showing some degree of respect. He's like, look, I know you're not with me now. I know we're not together now. So it's still I more than we, and it might still be a little bit more of you than thou. He says thou, but then he shifts back to you when he's acknowledging that she's kind of being cold to him. That's what the article points out. Whenever he's acknowledging that she's not really acting into him, he shifts to the formal second person pronoun. It's always you. You're kind of cold. You're coy. You don't really seem to be into this that much. So that's what he says when he's expressing that kind of idea. But when he's imagining intimacy, when he's imagining them as a couple, he says we, and he says thou. He uses the intimate second person singular pronoun, and he uses the plural first person pronoun. We could be doing stuff together. Thou could be doing cool stuff that I could admire because I want us to be a couple. So these are important shifts to keep track of, right? In fact, he keeps repeating you as he's kind of politely telling her that she can remain distant and coy as long as they have nothing but time. I already read you those. I would love you, but you should, if you please, refuse. So that's fine for now. But then he moves on. Later on, when he starts getting a little bit more romantic, when he starts talking about what he would want to praise and admire, you might also notice, more specifically, he starts talking about her physical attributes. He starts talking about body parts, like literal body parts. He names several. And when he's talking about her body parts, he shifts back to the more intimate second person pronoun. Thine eyes. That's like the more formal version of your eyes, right? Thine eyes. So he's getting intimate again, right? He's getting a little bit more romantic as he's thinking about her body. He's thinking about perhaps other things, and the tone shifts. It's more intimate. It's not as formal, right? But then by the end of part one, he gets formal again. Because again, he's reminding himself that they are still separate. And she is a lady. And she deserves respect, right? But he's also acknowledging that she's cold. He's saying, I would spend thousands of years admiring you, all of this, and the last stage should show your heart. Another little sly indicator that she's being cold. And he's using that formal pronoun, your heart, not thine heart, your heart, because they're distant again. He's acknowledging that as much as he's into her, she might not necessarily feel that way, and they're not a couple yet. So again, the pronoun usage is a clue. It's a key to unlocking further meaning, deeper meaning. So that's a cool way to approach the poem. I just wanted to show you guys this because this is an example of taking a particular critical approach. We would call this a formalist approach because it's very focused on the formal structures of language. Words, sentences, in this case, pronouns. And you might think, well, geez, how much can I really say about pronouns in the poem? Well, this scholar got a full article out of it, a 20-page article just about pronouns, but more importantly, about how pronouns express larger meaning in the poem. So just a couple more examples that might be interesting. Again, going back and forth between I and we, right? So like I said, he begins the poem with a note of solidarity. He's envisioning the kind of relationship he wants. They're together. It's we. But then later, he shifts back to I. In fact, for most of the first section, remember lines 1 through 20, he's mostly saying I. He says I a lot. On line 6, in line 7, in line 20, he says my in line 11, another singular first person pronoun, just one of you. So again, he's being pretty formal in most of part one. For most of part one, he's allowing there to be some distance between them because there really is distance between them. They're not together yet, right? He's just wishing that they were. So he does use some formal thous and thines, and he does say we once or twice, but mostly he sticks to singular first person, recognizing that there's still an I and a you, and he sticks mostly with you because that's the more formal, respectful way of addressing somebody that you're not intimate with, and they're not intimate yet. So that's what's happening in the first section. But then in the second section, he gets more intimate because he's acknowledging that they need to create an intimate relationship soon, right away. So look on line 25. He talks about thy beauty. Again, that's the more intimate version of your beauty. So he's addressing her, but in a way that suggests that they're close, that they have that kind of close relationship, right? But then later, when he's again kind of criticizing her for being cold, he shifts back to you. So when he mentions the virginity, the honor, he says, your quaint honor. And that's very much an insult. Like he's kind of belittling the honor and saying, who cares? Like, I know you think it's important, but who cares? When you're dead, it won't be important at all. So again, he's shifting back to the more formal second person pronoun when he's calling attention to her, like rejecting him or remaining kind of cold to him. Right? So he gets more intimate for a while, but then by the end of the second section, he shifts back to the more formal you because he's like, yeah, I guess you value your honor and all of that stuff, but I wish you wouldn't. So that takes us to the final section. And here's what's weird about the final section. There are no formal second person pronouns, and there's no singular first person pronouns. None of those are left. We are only intimate now, and we are only together now. There's no more I. There's only we or our. If you track the occurrence of the words our, you'll see a lot of that. Our sweetness, our time, right? He keeps referring to things that they share. He's saying we. He's saying our. So those are the plural forms of the first person pronoun. So he's not alone anymore in that third section. Now it's a lot of we and a lot of our. Right? In fact, you get the first person plural pronoun 11 times in the final 10 lines. Let us sport while we may. Our time, our strength, our sweetness. So he keeps emphasizing this togetherness, right? So what does that mean? Are they actually together? Is he just reflecting reality? Or again, is this just what he wants? He wants them to be together, and he's really trying to convince her. So in that third section, there's no more formal you, and there's no more singular I. It's all intimate thou or thine, and all plural or, plural first person we and our. So notice that shift, right? By the end, he's a lot more intimate. He's a lot more familiar. What does that mean? And they're very much envisioned as a couple by the end. Is that reality, or is that just what he wants? So you guys probably know, and if you don't know, you can Google and find out immediately that this poem is often thought of as an example of seduction. The speaker is trying to seduce the woman that he is addressing. Some people might think it's romantic, flattering at times. Other people might think it's a little bit funny, kind of over the top, almost kind of intentionally sort of goofy and silly. Others might find it a little bit threatening, ominous. You have to decide how you feel about the speaker. He is courting this woman, but what do you think about his intentions, his strategies? Is he trying to scare her with her own mortality, the fear of death? Is he trying to coerce her or manipulate her? Does he really only want a physical relationship? Is he only after physical intimacy, or does he want a real, close romantic relationship? What exactly is he up to? And think about his strategies. How effective are his strategies? And then also think about the woman he's addressing. What role does she play? And how does she factor into all of this? More modern readers often get kind of turned off by the speaker. They might think he's kind of creepy, a little bit pushy. We might think his argument is a little bit problematic in various ways. So that's part of what you guys need to do when you interpret. Form your own conclusions. All right, so that's it for this week. Next week, we return to the textbook. Okay, so we're going to read chapter 2. That's all about traditional approaches to literature. We can use a lot of those. So we'll talk about that next week. Let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.